Dorset, late August, 1812. The garden party at Halcombe House had been arranged with a purpose that Lady Eudora Halcombe had shared with precisely 2 people, and concealed from everyone else with the practiced ease of a woman who had been orchestrating outcomes for 3 decades. The Duke of Briarstead required a wife. This was not new information. The county had known it for 2 years, the way counties know things, through the accumulated weight of observation and inference and the particular attention that prosperous communities pay to unmarried men of significant title. What was new was that the Duke of Briarstead had, after 2 years of refusing every introduction, every dinner arrangement, every carefully positioned young woman at every carefully managed occasion, agreed to attend a garden party at which Sirène Tolvine would be present. He had not agreed to meet her. He had agreed to attend, which Lady Eudora understood as the same thing, and the Duke understood as something he could leave at any point without obligation. The Tolvane family had a fortune built on shipping, Bristol docks, Mediterranean routes, a fleet that had survived the war years through the particular intelligence of Aldrich Tolvane, who had a gift for knowing which risks were calculated and which were reckless, and who had passed this gift, along with the fortune it produced, to his daughter. Sirène was 23. She had been managing the household accounts since she was 15. She had her father's mind for numbers, and her mother's gift for making a room want to listen to her, which was, Lady Eudora had noted on 3 separate occasions, a combination the county had not seen before and did not entirely know what to do with. The Duke of Briarstead had not laughed in 2 years. The county knew this, too. They knew it, the way they knew the Halcombe roses bloomed in June and the River Severn flooded in March, as a fact of the landscape, unremarkable because it was constant. But Lady Eudora, who had known the Duke since he was a boy, and had watched him become this locked and silent version of himself, did not consider it a fact. She considered it a problem, and Lady Eudora did not tolerate unsolved problems past their 2nd season. Sirène arrived at Halcombe House on a Wednesday afternoon in the last week of August, with her father and the quiet attention of a woman who had been told very little about why this particular garden party mattered, and had deduced the rest herself. She wore a dress the color of late summer, not quite gold, not quite cream, the kind of choice that said taste without saying effort, though effort was precisely what had gone into it, and she saw no point in pretending otherwise. She had been told 3 things about the Duke of Briarstead: that he was wealthy, that he was silent, and that he had once been neither. The 3rd piece of information interested her more than the first 2 combined. The garden at Halcombe House was designed for exactly this kind of afternoon, wide enough for circuits, private enough for conversations, and arranged with the particular intelligence of a hostess who understood that the best social engineering looked like landscaping. There were 40 guests. Sirène identified the Duke before Lady Eudora pointed him out, which was its own kind of information. He was standing at the far edge of the south lawn, near the walled garden, slightly apart from the nearest group in a way that was not rude, but was absolute. He was taller than she had expected, and younger than she had been warned, which was the first surprise. The second was the quality of his stillness, not the vacancy of a man with nothing to say, but the containment of a man who had decided that what he had to say wasn't worth the cost of saying it. She had seen grief before, she had seen anger, and she had seen pride. She had not seen someone build an architecture out of silence and inhabit it with such complete conviction. He was watching the garden, not the guests, the garden itself. The late roses along the south wall, the gravel paths, the way the afternoon light moved across the lawn. He watched it with the attention of a man who preferred landscapes to people, and she thought, with the precision she brought to first impressions, he is not bored. He is in pain, and this is what his pain looks like when it has had 2 years to become a habit. Their eyes met once across the lawn, briefly, with the unintentional accuracy of two people who had been aware of each other's position for 20 minutes and had been managing not to look. She did not smile. He did not look away. And then he did, and she noted the speed of it, and went to find Lady Eudora and asked to be introduced. Lady Eudora arranged the introduction at the entrance to the walled garden, a strategic choice of territory that Seren, who had spent 8 years watching her father negotiate contracts, recognized instantly. Lady Eudora excused herself with the transparent efficiency of a woman who had delivered 2 people to the same square of gravel and intended to let the gravel do its work. They walked. This had not been discussed. They simply began moving along the path into the walled garden, and Seren understood from the way he walked, unhurried, shoulders set, eyes forward, that he conducted conversations in motion because stillness required him to look at people, and looking at people required him to be present in a way he had spent 2 years learning to avoid. "Lady Eudora tells me your father's business is in shipping," he said. His voice was lower than she had expected. Not quiet exactly, but economical, as though each word had been weighed before release, and several had been put back. "It is, and that you are involved in its management. I run the household accounts, the Bristol office correspondence, and the quarterly reviews," she said. "My father calls it involvement. I call it the majority of the work." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not a smile, the ghost of where a smile would have been if he had allowed it passage. It appeared and was suppressed in the same instant, and she watched it happen with the attention of a woman who had just seen something she was not supposed to see. He stopped walking. They were at the center of the walled garden, beside the stone bench beneath the espaliered pear tree. "I will be direct with you, Miss Tolvain. I would prefer it. I require a wife of steady temperament, a woman capable of managing a household of considerable size without requiring constant society. A woman who understands the value of composure." He paused. "Of quiet." She looked at the suppressed ghost at the corner of his mouth and the set of his jaw, and the way he had said the word quiet, as though it were not a preference, but a prescription. "You have been married before," she said. The stillness changed quality. "Yes. And your first wife wasn't quiet." The pause was long enough to hear the garden. "My first wife was the most charming woman in any room she entered. She could make anyone laugh. She made everyone laugh." Another pause. "She was also the most dishonest person I've ever known, and I discovered this after the damage was complete." He looked at the pear tree. He looked at the stone bench. He looked at anything that was not her face. "I do not require charm, Miss Tolvain. I have seen what charm conceals. I require gravity." Serene understood, with a clarity that arrived fully formed, that the man in front of her had loved a woman who made everyone laugh, and had been destroyed by what lived behind the laughter, and had built his silence over the wreckage like a wall, and was now explaining the wall as though it were a blueprint. When he said gravity, he meant safety. When he said charm conceals, he meant he had been fooled once and would not be fooled again. And he had looked at her across the lawn and seen her mother's gift, the warmth, the way a room leaned toward her, and had categorized it as the very thing that had nearly destroyed him. He was not describing what he wanted. He was describing what he was afraid of, and he had just told her, without realizing it, that she was the thing he feared most. She laughed, not the practiced social laugh she had learned in Bristol drawing rooms, not the polite, measured thing that women were taught to produce at appropriate moments in appropriate volume. She laughed the way her mother had laughed, sudden, warm, unguarded, with the full weight of genuine feeling behind it, because the man standing in front of her had just explained, with complete seriousness and considerable dignity, that he was looking for a wife who would not make him feel anything, and he had done it in a garden full of roses, while the late afternoon light made everything around them impossibly alive. He stared at her. She did not cover her mouth, or apologize, or perform the small social corrections that were supposed to follow an unexpected laugh in the presence of a duke. She let it live its full natural length, and then it ended on its own, and she looked at him with clear eyes and said, "Forgive me, Your Grace. That was not a judgment." What was it? His voice had changed. Something had shifted, not warmth, but a tension of a different quality, the kind that arrives when expectations are contradicted, and the person has not yet decided whether to be offended or curious. "Recognition," she said. "You have just described the loneliest life I can imagine, and you described it as a plan. I laughed because it is the saddest thing I have heard this year, and I didn't have another response available to me that would have been honest." He said nothing. The silence was not the composed, architectural silence she had observed from across the lawn. It was a fracture in the architecture, the kind that happens when a structure is struck by something it was not designed to absorb. She held his gaze for one moment longer. Then she inclined her head, a small, precise gesture, neither a bow nor a dismissal, the kind of thing that said, "I have seen you, and I am not performing for you, and I am going now. Good afternoon, Your Grace." She walked out of the walled garden and across the south lawn, and collected her father from the company of Sir Aldous Fenmore, and was in the carriage before Lady Eudora had fully registered what had occurred. Her father said nothing until they were past the Halcombe gates. "Well," he said. "He is shopping for silence, father," she said. "He wants a quiet house and a full treasury. He is not looking for a wife. He's looking for an absence." Her father was quiet. "The man has been through a great deal, Seren. Lady Lenore was—" "I know what Lady Lenore was," she said. "I also know what I am. And I am not a remedy for someone else's wound." Her father looked out at the Dorset countryside in the late August light. "What will you do?" he said. "The Carden Hall property," she said. "The estate we acquired through the Belmont default last spring. The house is structurally sound. The grounds are neglected, but the bones are extraordinary. Southern aspect, good soil, and the old gardens were designed by someone who understood what they were doing. The harbor road runs along the eastern boundary." Her father nodded slowly. He knew the property, a debt settled in land rather than currency. "It is 4 miles from Briarstead," he said. "It is excellent property, father. The harbor access alone justifies the investment. Seren? It is a business decision." He regarded her with the comprehensive understanding of what his daughter's business decisions looked like when they were purely business, and what they looked like when they were something else dressed in business clothes. He said nothing further. She looked out the window and thought about a walled garden with espaliered pears and a man who had suppressed a smile when she mentioned the quarterly reviews, and what it meant that suppressing it had cost him visible effort. She thought about the word gravity, and the particular sound it made when a man used it to describe the walls of his own cage without recognizing the bars. And she almost believed that Carden Hall was entirely about the harbor access. Carden Hall was occupied by the second week of September because Seren Tolvan had her father's solicitors and her father's accounts, and the focused determination of a woman who had decided something and saw no virtue in delay. The Duke of Briarstead, Leander Ashmore, though the county rarely used the name and the man himself seemed to have retired it, was informed of his new neighbor by his steward, who mentioned it during the weekly estate review with the careful casualness of a man presenting significant information as though it were incidental. "Miss Tolvane," the Duke said. He set down the ledger. Aldrich Tolvain's daughter. Yes, Your Grace. She took possession on the 12th. The Duke looked at the window that faced west, toward the ridge of hills where the old stone bridge crossed the River Bride, and the land opened into Carden Hall Valley beyond. The bridge, he said. Has it been inspected recently? Not since your father's time, Your Grace. Have it done, he said, before the month is out. His steward noted this, and the estate review continued, but the Duke looked at the west window twice more before it was finished. She was settled at Carden Hall by the 3rd week of September, which surprised the county. September was for the final rounds of summer entertaining, for the harvest festivals, for the gradual turn toward the autumn calendar. September in the country was for people whose standing required no introduction. Seren arrived on a Monday with 2 carriages of household goods, a housekeeper from the Tolvain house in Bristol, and a surveyor whose specialty was property boundaries and water rights. Dorset noticed all of it, being prosperous enough and close enough to its own history that anything new was observed, assessed, and discussed within the week. She spent the first days learning the property, every room, every outbuilding, every acre, with the methodical attention of a woman conducting an inventory she intended to act on. The house was sound but tired. The kitchen garden had been expanded and left to seed. The south wing had been opened for renovation and sealed again when the money stopped. And the old gardens, the ones that had drawn her attention in the land agent's report, were overgrown to the point of obscurity. 3 seasons of unchecked growth burying what had once been the finest private gardens in the western county. She had a restoration plan drawn up by Thursday. On Friday morning, she went to look at the bridge. The old stone bridge crossed the River Bride at the northern boundary, where her property met Briarstead land. A single arch, well proportioned, built the previous century by someone who understood stone and water. It was also in serious disrepair. The north parapet partially collapsed, the drainage channels blocked, the road surface deteriorated beyond safe use for loaded carts. She stood on the Carden side and thought about access and cost, and the fact that any repair would require agreement with the Duke. She heard the horse before she saw it. He came from the Briarstead side on a dark bay, at a pace that said he had known where she was and had come deliberately. He pulled up at the bridge and looked at her across it with the contained attention she recognized from the walled garden. Miss Tolvain? Your Grace. She did not perform any formality. They were standing at a river in September. I see you have wasted no time. The property required attention, the bridge most urgently. My steward tells me you have engaged a surveyor. I have, for the water rights and the boundary. So have I. The river moved beneath them with the unhurried persistence of water that had been following this course for centuries and had no interest in the affairs of the people standing above it. Then we shall have 2 surveys, she said, and they will either agree, in which case the matter is simple, or they will not, in which case the matter is interesting. Something shifted in his expression, not the contained assessment, something less managed, carrying in it the faintest echo of the suppressed smile from the walled garden. You find disputes interesting, he said. I find clarity interesting. Disputes are merely the path to it. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the old gardens at Carden Hall. I understand you intend to restore them. I do. The original design was exceptional. The neglect is an offense. The original design, he said, was by Josias Hallam, commissioned in 1764 by the Second Belmont. The planting scheme followed a south-to-north gradient, aligned with the natural water table. He stopped. He appeared to register that he had just spoken more consecutive words about a garden than he had spoken about anything in recent memory. You know the gardens, she said. I know the county, he said, which was not the same answer, and they both recognized it. The south terrace retaining wall has collapsed, and the original beds are buried. My surveyor believes the drainage must be excavated before any replanting. The stonework carts will need access across the Briarstead meadow." "You have it," he said. Then, after a pause so brief it might have been imagined, "Write to me about the specifications, not the steward. Write to me directly." "Good morning, Your Grace." "Good morning, Miss Tolvain." He turned the horse and rode back toward Briarstead, and she stood on the bridge in the September air and thought about the word directly, and about a man who knew the name of the architect who had designed these gardens 60 years ago and had volunteered the information unprompted and had then retreated from it, as though he had shown her a room he had not meant to unlock. She went back to Carden Hall and did not think about any of it for the rest of the morning. With limited success. The surveys were completed within the fortnight. The bridge was a shared structure, jointly maintained since 1753, repair costs divided equally. This was straightforward. The question of the water channels that fed from both properties into the river was not, modified over decades without formal record, maintained by informal habit, now in need of clarification that neither estate's records could cleanly provide. She wrote to the Duke. The letter took 2 drafts. The first was too familiar. The second was precisely correct, factual, specific, concluding with a proposal to meet at the bridge to review the documents together. His reply arrived the following morning, in his own hand. "Miss Tolvain, I have reviewed both surveys. The discrepancy in the channel records is noted. I propose Thursday next, 10 o'clock, at the bridge. Bring the Carden deeds. I will bring the Briarstead records." Briarstead. She read this twice. She noted the complete absence of social ornamentation, just the time and the documents, and the expectation of her presence. She found this, against her better judgment, considerably more appealing than courtesy would have been. Thursday was clear and sharp. She arrived at 5 minutes to 10. He was already there, on foot, the Briarstead records in hand. They spread the documents on the stone parapet and stood on opposite sides of the bridge and examined each other's evidence with the focused attention of 2 people who were each entirely correct and entirely unable to reconcile their positions without concession. She argued the legal record. He argued the historical practice. She cited the deeds. He cited the maintenance logs. And somewhere in the middle of it, somewhere between the 1779 drainage modification and the 1802 channel extension, the quality of the conversation changed. It stopped being a negotiation and became, without either of them acknowledging it, a conversation between 2 people who were both good at this and were enjoying the discovery that someone could keep up. "You have done this before," he said. "Argued terms." "My father's shipping contracts involve a considerable number of negotiations," she said. "I have been present for most of them since I was 16. Your father brings you to contract negotiations. My father brings me to everything. He has no sons. He has me. He decided when I was 12 that this was either an obstacle or an asset, and has operated on the assumption of the latter." She met his gaze. "He has not been wrong." "I propose we formalize the existing channel arrangement," he said. "Briarstead continues the eastern channel. Carden takes the western, both recorded properly. You could claim the eastern channel through 40 years of established practice. I could. Why don't you? Because a year of legal letters would cost both estates more than the channels are worth, and at the end of it, one of us would have a precedent, and the other would have a grievance." He looked back at her. "I prefer a functional neighbor to a legal victory." "I accept," she said, "on the condition that the formal record reflects the legal basis, not the historical practice." A pause. "Agreed." She extended her hand across the parapet. He looked at it in a glove that was good leather and faintly ink-stained at the right thumb. and shook it. Brief, firm. And she thought, as his hand released hers, that his grip had lasted 1/2 second longer than a handshake required. She walked back to Carden Hall with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had held her ground and been met with something she had not expected from a man she had been told to expect nothing from. The county dinners began in October. Dorset society in autumn was a closed circuit. The same families, the same houses, the same conversations passed through the same rooms with the ease of people who had perfected social ritual into an art. Serene had been received with cautious warmth. She was wealthy enough to be included. She was not titled enough to be assumed. She and the Duke attended the same dinner 3 times in October. The first was at Fenmore House, where they exchanged one remark about the bridge repair, which Lady Fenmore overheard, and which became the most discussed topic at the second dinner. The second was at Halcombe House, arranged by Lady Eudora with undisguised intention. The third was at Briarstead itself, where Serene spent 40 minutes discussing soil composition with old Mr. Hathorn, because Mr. Hathorn knew things about the Carden soil that her surveyor did not, and the South Terrace depended on precision. She was aware, during the conversation with Mr. Hathorn, that the Duke was listening, not visibly, but she had developed a working sense of where his attention was directed, and it was, with a frequency she noted, directed toward her. She had also learned, across the 3 dinners, that wherever the Duke appeared, Pembury followed with the gravitational loyalty of a man who had attached himself to a title and confused proximity with equivalence. The autumn assembly at Fenmore House was the first large gathering of the season. 50 guests, the full county. The Duke was across the room when she entered, and he looked up, and the attention she had learned to identify was undisguised for 1/2 second before the containment returned. The evening proceeded. Circuits, conversations, the choreography of 50 people managing their positions. She talked about the restoration with the Fenmore daughters, about the Harbor Road with Sir Aldous. The Duke appeared at Sir Aldous' elbow at some point and stayed, and the 3 of them discussed roads and bridges until Sir Aldous was collected by his wife, and then it was the 2 of them, and the conversation moved without either of them steering it, from bridges to the South Terrace, to a question he asked about the Bristol shipping office. That was the first question he had ever asked about her rather than about the land. She answered. He listened. He asked a second. She thought, "This is what it looks like when he is actually present." She thought, "I should not be keeping notes on what he looks like when he is actually present." Lord Darville Pembury arrived at her left shoulder. She had seen him circling for 20 minutes with the tracking attention she brought to rooms. She had been navigating difficult social spaces since she was 16, and she could identify the calibration of a person's intent by the quality of their approach within 30 seconds of observing it. Pembury's approach had the deliberate trajectory of a man who had chosen his moment and his audience. 5 people stood within easy hearing. "Miss Tulvane, Carden Hall is looking well, I understand. Extensive improvements." "Thank you." The gardens required significant attention. "Gardens," he said, with a smile aimed at the listeners. "One does wonder, with such ambitious restoration," a theatrical pause, "whether the investment matches the likely permanence of the arrangement." She held his gaze. "That is to say," he continued, "Dorset has a certain character, an established order. One hopes new arrivals appreciate the nature of the county before embarking on too ambitious a program of improvement." The word did exactly the work he had designed it to do. In a different mouth, neutral. In his, it meant, "You are merchant money in Old Dorset, and you have overreached, and everyone here knows it." She was formulating her response when the Duke spoke. "The restoration at Carden Hall," the Duke said from her right, in a voice she had not heard before. Not the garden voice, not the bridge voice, but the one beneath all of them, the one that carried 200 years of Dorset in it and understood precisely what weight it held, follows the original Hallam design of 1764, which was considered the finest private commission in the Western County. The work Miss Tolvain has undertaken has resolved drainage failures, affecting both the Carden and Briarstead water systems, for over a decade. He turned that complete, unhurried attention, the same that had once been directed at her in the walled garden, on Pembury. The investment is entirely proportionate, as anyone familiar with the land would know. Pembury's smile underwent a rapid adjustment. "Of course, Your Grace, I merely—" "The county," the Duke said, with the economy of a man who did not require volume, benefits from landowners who take their property seriously. I believe we are all agreed on that." He held Pembury's gaze one moment longer than necessary, the ducal equivalent of a closing argument, then returned to the conversation as though nothing had occurred. Pembury found someone else to address, with the haste of a man corrected in public, who required distance to reassemble. Seren stood beside the Duke in the aftermath and thought about what had just happened, the weight of what he had said, how he had said it, and the fact that he had spoken at all. He did not look at her. He was discussing county road improvements with Sir Aldous, and nothing about his manner suggested he had just done something significant. She crossed to the far side of the room, where Lady Eudora stood with a glass of wine and the expression of a woman who had watched the entire exchange. "He intervened," Seren said. "He did not have to," Lady Eudora agreed. "And Pembury will be cautious for the remainder of the season. He made it about the land, so that Pembury had no graceful way to continue, so that the room understood his position without a personal declaration, and so that you were defended without being diminished." She paused. "Which is a very specific kind of intelligence." Serene held her glass and thought about 2 months of bridge surveys and water channels, and a man who had told her he required gravity and had spent the subsequent weeks discovering that hers carried a different weight than he had calculated. "He was wrong about me," she said. "In the garden." "Yes," Lady Eudora said, "and he knows it. He has known it for some time. He is a man who keeps careful accounts. He required sufficient evidence before revising the ledger." Seren considered the laugh in the walled garden, the honest, unguarded one that had cracked his architecture. She considered the version of herself who had produced it, and the version standing in this room 2 months later with a wine glass and a garden restoration and a county that was beginning to understand what she was. Serene looked across the room at the Duke. He looked back. Not the contained attention, the other one. The one she had stopped pretending not to notice. She held his gaze for 1 beat longer than the social register required, and then turned back to Lady Eudora, and the assembly continued around them, and neither said anything further that evening, and it cost them both considerably. November brought the first real cold and a discovery. The east border excavation uncovered stone foundations from an earlier garden that no one had known existed. She wrote to the Duke on Monday, a professional inquiry about whether the Briarstead archive held any records of pre-Hallam gardening at Carden. He arrived on Tuesday afternoon, which wasn't what she had expected. She was kneeling beside the excavation in a work dress she would not have chosen for receiving a Duke, but she had stopped arranging herself for his benefit sometime in October and was not going to resume. He came through the garden gate and stood at the edge of the excavation with an expression she had never seen on him. Not containment, not assessment, but something unguarded and immediate. "These are Tudor," he said. He crouched beside the exposed stonework and ran his hand along the foundation wall. Pre-1600. This was a knot garden. She looked at his hand on the stone, and his face, which had lost the architectural quality entirely, and thought, "This is who he is when he forgets to be careful. You knew this was here. I suspected. My grandfather's papers mention a garden at Carden that predated the Hallam Commission. He described it as remarkable. You have your grandfather's papers? The Brierstead archive goes back to the 16th century. It is the faintest suggestion of something at the corner of his mouth, comprehensively organized. By whom? By me. She looked at him standing in her garden, with soil on his hands, and the nearest thing to animation she had witnessed from him, talking about Tudor knot gardens and family archives he had organized himself. And she understood that the man who had told her he required gravity, and the man illuminated from the inside by old stone foundations, were not two different people. They were the same man, one with the wall raised, and one with the wall briefly, accidentally, lowered. She showed him the excavation. He identified the knot garden layout from the foundation lines alone. 4 quadrants, a central axis, the characteristic geometry of the late Tudor period. He pointed out where the paths would have run and where the water feature would have stood. She listened, took notes, and did not mention that his voice had changed, that the economy was gone, that words were arriving without being weighed, that he was speaking the way people speak when they have forgotten to monitor themselves. At one point, while she was explaining the soil analysis, she made a remark about her surveyor's handwriting being less legible than a 16th century monk's, and something happened. He almost laughed. Not the suppressed ghost from the walled garden. This was closer, a sound that began in his chest and reached his throat and was stopped there, physically, by a reflex so practiced it was nearly involuntary. He caught it the way a man catches a glass before it falls. She did not remark on it. She continued the soil analysis as though nothing had occurred, and gave him the privacy of the moment, and thought, that was closer. That was very close. She offered tea. He accepted, the first time he had accepted anything at Carton Hall, and they sat in the library for 40 minutes and discussed the Tudor garden, and then a book on landscape history she had on the shelf that he had also read, and neither of them mentioned the walled garden or the word gravity, and the afternoon was entirely about old stones and garden plans, and entirely not. December brought frost, and the frost brought urgency. The east border, where the Tudor foundations had been excavated, was exposed, and the cold threatened the uncovered stonework. Saren spent 3 days in the December chill with her estate manager, laying protective coverings and redirecting water channels. She wrote to the Duke on Monday about the channel diversion. He arrived on Tuesday, on foot, through the garden gate. She was kneeling beside the foundations when she saw him, in a coat that was practical rather than fashionable, carrying a rolled document under his arm. I brought the grandfather's papers, he said. The original survey of the pre-Hallam garden. It may help with the covering work. His gaze moved across the south terrace, the east border, with its careful protective layers, the full scope of what she had accomplished since September, a complete reassessment, conducted in silence. You have done all of this in 3 months. The property required it. The property did not require a Tudor excavation. That was yours. The garden deserved to be known. What was buried deserved to be uncovered. Something moved in his expression. Something that was not about gardens. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, I owe you an apology. She waited. In the walled garden, in August. What I said, the manner in which I said it, was not how I should have spoken to you. He was looking at the Tudor foundations rather than at her. I walked into that conversation with a position already formed, a position that had nothing to do with you and everything to do with Lady Lenore, she said. He looked at her. I understood that day, she said. That is why I laughed instead of arguing. Not because you were foolish, because I understood you were not seeing me at all. You were managing a history I had no part in. The laugh was the only honest response I had. It said what needed saying. I see you. I am not arguing. I am going. His eyes went to the foundations, old stones, uncovered after centuries, laid bare by a woman who believed that buried things deserved light. I have thought about that laugh every day since August, he said. For the first week I thought about it as a judgment, then as a diagnosis, then as a kindness. And then I understood that it was all three, and that the woman who could deliver all three in a single sound was not a woman who lacked gravity. She was a woman whose gravity operated at a depth I had not known how to reach. I am not Lady Lenore, she said. I know. I'm not a quieter version of Lady Lenore. I'm not a safer version. I am not the correction. I know. I have known since September. His eyes went to the restored South Terrace. You are not a safer version of anything. You are the most disruptive force I have encountered in a decade of managing a very large estate. And I mean that as a complete and honest assessment of my situation. She looked at the man standing in her garden, with his grandfather's papers under his arm, and an apology delivered without a single qualifying word. She thought about the walled garden in August, and the version of himself he had been then, armored, assessing, already decided, and the version standing before her now, with soil on his boots and honesty in his voice, and the distance between the two, measured in bridge repairs and Tudor foundations, and a laugh he had thought about every day for 4 months. She opened the gate, the one that led from the east border into the walled kitchen garden, the private one, the one that was not for visitors. Come in, she said. The foundations are worth seeing properly, and I believe I owe you tea. He came through the gate. He fell into step beside her on the path toward the house. The December morning was sharp and clear, and the restored beds were sleeping under their winter coverings, and nothing had been resolved, and everything had been said that needed to be said first. She thought, there is more to say. She thought, it will keep until the tea. The tea was in the Carden library. She had chosen the library because it was where she worked, and because she was not going to arrange a drawing room for him as though this were a morning call. It was not a morning call. It was a man who had come through a gate she had opened, who had carried his grandfather's papers as an offering, and who was now sitting in the chair across from her desk, with nothing managed in his expression at all. Mrs. Garrow brought the tea and withdrew. Seren poured, handed him his cup, and sat back in her chair. His attention moved to the books, the desk covered in estate papers and garden surveys, taking in all of it with the focus of a man reading a room and finding it more legible than he had expected. You work here, he said, every morning. Not the drawing room. The drawing room is for visitors. The library is for work. She paused. You are not a visitor. What am I? You are my neighbor, with whom I share a bridge, a water system, and a set of Tudor foundations. The drawing room would be excessive. He drank his tea. In my experience, women who maintain working libraries are either eccentric or formidable. And which have you determined? I have been revising the categories since approximately September. She thought about the apology at the gate, the undeflected one, and about the 3 months she had spent trying to dislike him with consistency, and the growing evidence that consistency on this point was no longer available to her. Leander, she said. He stilled. She had not used his name before. She had used his title and his grace and the careful distance of formality, and now the name was in the Carden library between them, and neither of them could retrieve it. Yes, he said. I bought this estate because of you, she said. Not entirely. The property is sound. The investment was rational. All of it remains true. But I bought it, knowing it was 4 miles from yours. And I told myself it was business, and I almost believed it for about 3 weeks. She looked at the survey maps on the desk. I was angry. I wanted you to see me. Not the fortune and the father and the category I had been assigned. I thought if I were your neighbor, if I were here, visible, undeniable, you would have to see me eventually. That was not a mature strategy, she said. It was an effective one, he said. It resulted in a bridge dispute and a drainage negotiation and a tutor excavation. It resulted in you being here in this library having this conversation. He paused. I consider the investment entirely sound. He stood. He came around the desk and stood before her chair. And she stood, because this was not a conversation for sitting. And they were very close in the Carden Library, with the December light and the survey maps between them and 4 months of bridges and gardens behind them. I was wrong about you, he said. In the walled garden. I was wrong before I met you, and I was wrong during the meeting, and I have spent every day since accumulating evidence of exactly how wrong I was. His eyes held hers with nothing of containment left. I am asking whether I am too late to be right. She considered the laugh, the first one, the walled garden one, the one that had said, I see you, and I refuse to pretend this is reasonable. She thought about what it meant now, in this room, with this man who had stood at an assembly and told the county the investment was entirely proportionate, and had come through her garden gate and apologized without qualification. She did not laugh. She put her hand on his arm, flat, deliberate, and looked up at him and said, You are not too late. He covered her hand with his. And then, standing in the Carden Library with her hand on his arm and his hand over hers, Leander Ashmore, the Duke of Briarstead, who had not laughed in over 2 years, laughed. It was quiet. It was brief. It was the sound of a man who had kept a door locked for so long he had forgotten what was behind it, and had just opened it, and had found that what waited there was not the thing he feared. It was relief and recognition, and the specific sound of a wall coming down from the inside. What was that? She said. I believe that was the sound of my policies performing very badly. She laughed. The real one, the warm, ungoverned one from the walled garden. And his met hers in the Carden Library. And for a moment, both sounds existed in the same room, and neither required management. He kissed her. It was not tentative. It had the honesty of a man who had been revising his position for 4 months and had arrived at a conclusion he was prepared to act on. She kissed him back with the same precision she brought to contracts and garden plans and every true thing she had ever decided, and the library was warm, and the December afternoon was outside, and none of it required further analysis. When they separated, she kept her hand on his arm. The bridge, she said. Repaired. The water channels. Formalized. The Tudor foundations. Covered for winter. Are we conducting a full estate review? He said. I am establishing that the practical matters are in order before addressing the impractical ones. And are they in order? She looked at the survey maps and the desk and the man who had come through her gate and revised his accounting and told her she was the most disruptive force he had encountered in a decade. Yes, she said, they are entirely in order. The corner of his mouth did the thing she had catalogued since September, except it was not the almost smile anymore. It was the real thing. You are going to be very difficult to be married to, he said. Is that a proposal? It is a preliminary assessment, preceding a proposal. Your silence has been performing very badly in this neighborhood. Catastrophically, he agreed. I would recommend a complete revision. He took her hand. Seren. Her name. The specific, irreplaceable sound of it. Leander, she said, and it meant everything she had not said since August. January in Dorset was the county at its quietest and most perceptive. Seren and the Duke were engaged by the second week. He had asked formally in the Carden Library on a Monday morning, and she had said yes, and they had shaken hands before either registered the absurdity, and then he had looked at their joined hands, and she had laughed, and he had laughed back, and the sound was still new enough to surprise them both. Her father received the news with quiet satisfaction, the particular satisfaction of a man who had watched his daughter acquire a neighboring estate and had understood precisely what she was doing and had waited with patience for the outcome he had predicted. "The Duke of Briarstead," he said, looking up from the shipping accounts. "The man who told you he required gravity. He has revised that position considerably, has he? He came through my garden gate and apologized without qualification," she said, "and then sat in my library and told me the laugh in the walled garden was the most honest thing anyone had done in his presence in years." She paused. "I find I cannot hold a man's August against him when his December is everything it should be." He studied her with the attention of a man who had been watching this particular person since she was 12 and had never been bored by what he saw. "Is he good enough for you?" She considered it honestly. "He's trying to be. That is the best version of the answer." "It is the best version," he agreed. He wrote to the Duke that afternoon, a brief, direct letter containing the exact dimensions of the Tolvain fortune, stated without performance. The Duke's reply arrived the following morning, addressed to Seren, not her father. It said, "Your father's letter was generous and entirely beside the point. I am marrying you. The accounts will follow." She read it twice. She placed it in the desk drawer with his letters. There were 9, beginning with the first note about the bridge survey. Lady Eudora called on Wednesday with the energy of a woman who had been restraining herself for 4 days, which was the maximum restraint available to her. "Well," she said, before she had fully sat down. "Well," Seren agreed. He laughed. Lady Eudora said, "It was not a question. How did you know?" "Because the expression he wore when he called on me yesterday was not the expression of a man who has merely become engaged. It was the expression of a man who has remembered how to be happy." She accepted her tea. "You did that." "He did it," Seren said. "I was present in a way that made it possible. There is a difference. And it is exactly the difference that matters. You are good for him. He's good for me, which is the part I did not expect." "What did you expect?" Seren looked at the window, the south terrace, the east border, the covered foundations waiting for spring. "I expected to prove a point. I expected to be right." She paused. "I did not expect to discover that he was also right about certain things, and that the things he was right about were the things that made him worth the argument." "What was he right about?" "That a woman who carries genuine gravity is a remarkable thing. He had entirely the wrong definition, but the instinct was not wrong." Lady Eudora smiled, the real one. "The engagement dinner, first week of February, the full county." She paused at the library door. "Pembury will be invited, because it is better to have him at the table, where he must conduct himself appropriately, than outside it, where he will not. And because the sight of Lord Pembury congratulating you on your engagement to the Duke of Briarstead will be among the most satisfying things I have witnessed in some years." She paused. "I am not above enjoying it." "I find I am not above it either," Seren said. They were married in March, at the church in the village between the two estates, geographically convenient, socially correct, and a beautiful building with good east windows and stone floors that had been there since the 15th century. She wore the color of late summer, not quite gold, not quite cream, the same shade as the dress from the Holcomb garden party, because she believed in completing what she started, and because Leander had mentioned once that he remembered it. The county turned out. The marriage of a duke was always an occasion, and the marriage of this duke to this woman was an occasion with the additional quality of a story the county had been following since August. Seren walked in on her father's arm and looked at Leander at the front of the church and thought about the walled garden and the man who had told her he required gravity and the laugh she had given him on her way out of his life. She thought about all the versions. The first, honest and shocking. I see you, and I am not performing for you, and I am going. The second, absent, deliberately withheld at the assembly, composure chosen over warmth. The third, in the library, warm and shared, the first time her laugh and his had existed in the same room. She reached the front of the church. Leander looked at her with the full expression. Nothing of August in it. Nothing of the walled garden. Nothing of the man who had built his silence like a fortification. Just him. Entirely present. Looking at the woman who had bought the estate 4 miles away and restored the gardens and uncovered the foundations and laughed in his face when he told her he wanted silence and had been right about everything and had chosen him anyway. She took his hand. He held it and didn't let go. The county watched, and the county understood, and the county was, for once, entirely correct about what it was witnessing. He found her afterward in the Carden garden, where the south terrace was showing its first spring growth, and the east border waited for the season to turn. "The gardens are yours," he said. "All of it. The Hallam terrace, and the Tudor foundations, and the kitchen garden, and the bridge. All of it is yours in every sense that matters." She looked at the garden she had built from neglect and argument, and thought about gravity, what it had meant in August, what it meant now, and how completely a single word could reverse itself over 7 months when the right evidence was applied. "Leander, yes, I am going to redesign the east border entirely. I know. And I am going to reorganize the Brierstead archive. The system has no coherent logic." "The system," he said, with the expression she now had full permission to enjoy, "is yours." She stepped toward him. He met her in the center of the south terrace, between the restored beds and the March light, and the view of both estates. Brierstead on the horizon in one direction, Carden behind them, the bridge visible in the valley below. And in the garden, in the first warmth of spring, she laughed. Not the first laugh, not the walled garden one, not the shock and the departure, not the withheld one, not the shared one from the library. This was the fourth laugh, the one she had not planned, the one that arrived from the place where gravity and lightness were not opposites, but the same thing understood from different directions. It was warm and full and unmanaged, and it was not a judgment or a diagnosis or a kindness. It was joy arrived at honestly, through evidence. And Leander laughed with her. His laugh, still new, still surprising to both of them, met hers in the garden they had restored together. And for a moment the sound of it was the only thing in the March air, and it required no management at all. The best investments, her father had always said, were the ones you understood better after you had made them than before. She understood this one completely.